latest episode of the It's Canon podcast. The podcast where we talk about all things everything. We talk about all things geek. We talk about all things video games, all things toys, all things movies, all things books, all things Star Wars, all things Lego, anything and everything. And the best part of it all is that it's all in canon. Again, I am riding solo on this episode, and that's because Phil and Tyler deserve all the time off. Again, I want to thank them for all of the work that they've done on this podcast. It means a lot to me, as much as all of the listeners. That means the most to me. Again, we're reaching into the vault, and we're getting archived episode. Again, we still want to deliver content to you, so I figure we're going to hit the vault again. And this week, on today's episode, we're going to revisit an interview with Jim Zub. We recently re-interviewed Jim Zub in October. I believe it was late October. And it was a fun episode. And we made a lot of references to our first interview, which was 4 or 5 years ago. And I got it from the vault. We're going to play it in full. And it's interesting because this originally aired on August 9th, 2016. So 4.5 years ago. And listening to Jim Zub and the projects he wanted to work on and what he was working on. And this was right when Skull Kickers was ending, as Wayward was picking up steam, and as he started working on new IP. And it's funny to see where he was then, where he is now. So I think that contrast and that conversation, it was a fun one to revisit, and I hope that everyone has fun revisiting the same way that I had fun originally doing it. So, without further ado, here we go. Boris and Tyler interview Jim Zub. Hey everyone, welcome to the It's Canon podcast. It is another beautiful Sunday here in Toronto. As always, I am your host. I am Boris, and I am joined by
Tyler, that's me. And we have the amazing Jim Zub on as a guest this week, and our other host Kyle couldn't make it, unfortunately. So, 3 of us today.
Yeah. So, Jim, welcome. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on board, guys.
No, thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure. I know this week must have been a pretty busy, possibly tough week with Skull Kickers ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been really quite hectic, but not in a bad way. It's just been really, really busy between finishing off Skull Kickers and sending other projects off to press and convention stuff. The summer is always kind of insane.
Yeah,
so
I can imagine.
You just kind of got to get used to it. You sort of go, okay, this is how it's going to roll for a few months.
Right. So, for some of our listeners who may not know who Jim Zub is, he has written tons and tons of books. He's been in the scene for over 10 years. Really, if he's probably best known for Samurai Jack, Disney Kingdom's Figment, currently writing Wayward, just finished Skull Kickers. The list goes on and on and on and on.
And on.
And on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
Sounds like it. So just tell us, how does someone from Toronto end up writing comic books?
I came to it in kind of a weird angle, but I guess, the more people I talk to working in this business, I don't think anyone has a straightforward story. Like, every single person I've talked to who's working in comics came into it usually unexpectedly. There's very few people that sort of go, okay, I'm going to make comics, and then they just, end up exactly where they kind of expected. Yeah. So in my case, like a lot of other people, obviously I grew up a big comic book fan, but I didn't honestly think I would end up working in the business. When I was a kid, everything, especially in the superhero comic area, was all being done, out of New York, or at least it seemed that way. You would read about it, and it was like New York was kind of the hub of everything. And if you didn't live there, or you weren't some brilliant British guy like Alan Moore or Neil Gaiman, it just didn't seem like that was a viable kind of path.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got into animation originally. That's where my kind of creative background is. I went to school for classical animation at Sheridan College.
Awesome.
I took a year of film and multimedia at Humber, so I learned a little bit about sort of script writing and storytelling and cinematography stuff there. But I was sort of set pretty, dead set on working in animation. I knew there was quite a bit of animation stuff happening in Canada.
Yeah.
I knew that there was training I could get, and it just seemed like a much more viable kind of career path. Plus, you look at a movie and there's like tons of credits of people, so it's like, oh, I could be one of those people.
Yeah.
Look at the credits of a comic book, you're like, oh, there's like 3 or 4 people there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could, make the grade or make it in that, cut. So comics weren't the original plan. Obviously, I love them and, would love to work in them, but it wasn't sort of where I thought I would end up being. So I ended up working in animation for several years, working at a few different studios, working on a bunch of different kind of Canadian animation productions, contributing mostly in the background, what's called the layout department.
Okay.
And then the industry was really going through a lot of upheaval. The digital sort of revolution and 3D animation was really coming into its own. And my training had been very traditional, kind of hand-drawn animation shot on cameras and stuff. I was like the last year that they really focused on the film end of things as opposed to digital.
Oh, wow.
I was just on the wrong side of the line, and everything was switching over to digital, and I didn't have a lot of training on that front. So my original plan was to go back to school for 3D animation and get into video games or get into 3D.
Mm-hmm.
And I was signed up to go to a course, and I ended up that summer, before I was getting ready to go back to school, a friend of mine told me he was working at somewhere called the Udon Studio, or Udon Entertainment.
Okay.
And they're an art studio that was doing comic book stuff, and they were doing sort of art and design for all kinds of different aspects of the industry. And so I went there, and what was supposed to be a summer job just to make a little bit of money before I went back to school ended up sort of spinning off into a whole new career, where I started doing artwork for them, but then eventually moved into kind of like project management. And the opportunity came up on a couple projects for me to write, working with the artists at the studio. And I just realized how much I really, really loved that, and just really wanted to keep doing that sort of thing.
Awesome.
So long story short, like 9 years at the studio eventually turned into me starting to work on my own comics. I've been originally teaming up with a couple of the Udon artists, and now, that sort of parlayed that into all kinds of other comic book writing work bit by bit.
Yeah, and then you're kind of off to the races, so it just eventually builds momentum, and then now we're here.
Yeah, it's been, it seems sort of logical when you follow it through, but in the midst of it, it's not so clear. Like, you're sort of trying to figure out what you want to do. And, originally I was really focused on, okay, I'm going to be an animator, and I still have those skills. And I actually teach at Seneca College in their animation program.
Oh, awesome.
But yeah, which is a ton of fun, and I really love it. But in terms of storytelling, being able to collaborate with someone else and create a story, being able to build something like a comic with a nice tight-knit crew and see it come out, relatively quickly compared to film or compared to games or a lot of other medium, it's been really, really satisfying. And I realized how much I loved that. And the more I do, the more excited I get about it. So really now, particularly the last 2 to 3 years, it's really been a heavy focus for me, and it's something that I want to pursue more and more of. And so far so good. Like, I've had the opportunity to work with practically almost all the major comic publishers in North America, so everyone from Marvel to DC and Dark Horse, Image, Dynamite, and obviously Udon and IDW. Just, it's been a real roller coaster of opportunity.
Yeah. So you mentioned all these different companies, and like, Marvel, Image, DC, IDW, et cetera, how different are the processes within every company, for, as a writer, from getting the project to seeing it go out to the stores? How does the process vary from company to company?
I'd say it's even more than company to company. It's actually project to project. So it's like depending on the art team you're working with, or depending on whether it's creator owned or work for hire, and depending on kind of the processes that your editor has and the way that they work. Even within the same company, it can be quite varied, and so you kind of have to get used to each project is sort of going to have its own challenges or its own different kind of pipeline process. Sometimes you're more heavily involved in the decision making at every step, and other times my job as a writer is to contribute the script and then sort of step away and let the editor or let the other people kind of do their thing without much input. That's not the norm. I tend to be pretty involved. I like being involved in the whole process, and I like having an art background as well. I want to see the art as it's being developed. I want to be able to chime in and not necessarily just ask for changes, but just let people know what I'm thinking, or make sure that we're all kind of on the same page.
Exactly. You can be the most talented writer, and what you put down on words on a page and what someone reads that and then interprets that can be totally different.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's one of the things that's really interesting about writing comics is the text that you see, the dialogue or the captions. That's just one part of the writing. The script is almost like it's almost like you're cheerleading the artist, or you're trying to help them sort of fire their imagination to see not necessarily the exact same thing as you, but to be inspired to draw something that will exemplify the story and the concepts.
Yeah.
And so it's part of what I'm writing is actual text dialogue that's going to show up on the final page.
Yeah.
But I'm also just sort of getting a vision or inspiring them to want to draw, the scenes as they're set out, and collaborate back and forth.
Yeah.
The writer isn't just, I'm not in charge in the sense that I'm telling everyone what to do. It's about maybe putting the first elements down that we can then build off of as far as the story goes.
There's sort of like a project architect.
Yeah, I was going to say,
title to
it sounded like you were like the project management stuff you were saying. There's a lot of transferable skills that you're like, oh, I can do this, but instead of it being didactic, I think is the word I'm looking for. Instead of being that, it's very collaborative and it's the back and forth.
Yeah.
But still using those skills.
One of the nice advantages, because I had the experience working as a project manager at Udon and managing on all sorts of client projects, I learned a lot about working with other people, making sure that everyone knows what they need in order to get the job done, being able to build a schedule and hit deadlines. I know that doesn't sound very sexy. It's not very exciting.
But so
man,
important.
man, it's really useful.
Oh, yeah.
It's really useful to understand those elements of the business and to be able to bring those skills to bear. As much as you might want to just do your job, the reality is at the end of the day, knowing what other people's jobs are and what their responsibilities will be makes you better at your job, because you can then provide the things that they need, or you can be, you're that much more aware of what's required when you're putting together your piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And so the business stuff and the publishing stuff and all the client work that I did for years is really paid dividends on my own projects, where when I work with an editor, I've been an editor. Like, I know what would make me happy if I'm working on a project, or what kinds of things I can do to make their job easier. And those are the kind of people ideally, you want to keep working with. So hopefully I keep making a good impression and more projects come my way.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you have been, because you're. I feel like every week we're reviewing one of your books.
Yep.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a really cool feeling to be able to contribute, to so many properties that both, commercial ones like work for hire stuff, like Dungeons and Dragons or Conan or Samurai Jack or things like that. But then to be able to also leverage that to create my own stories and to be able to do both at the same time is really ideal. Because they're very different challenges, and I find that they make me a better writer. That being given a sort of framework or a sandbox to play in is very cool, and it helps generate a lot of ideas that I wouldn't have come up with on my own. But obviously, also being able to create stuff that's all mine and take that all the way to the hoop is very gratifying and is a different kind of a challenge. So when people ask me, they're like, "Oh, what do you prefer, creator-owned or work for hire?" I'm like, selfishly, I kind of want both.
Yeah.
I don't want to just pick one. So hopefully I can just, keep that rolling, having both types of projects underway.
Right. Actually, that's awesome, because I was about to ask you about that. Which would you prefer, and et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
No, it's a really common question, and I think it's what's nice about the industry right now is it doesn't have to be a binary kind of question. It doesn't
Exactly.
just have to be you only get to do one. The opportunities now, particularly in this space for creator owned, people want new stories, people want new concepts just as much as they want the familiar.
Yeah.
And you see the real resurgence of image comics and creator owned as a whole, and I think that that's a symbol of that. People are excited about the new. They're excited about different stories and genres and
Yeah.
stuff than they've seen before.
And it's also, as new readers are coming into comic books, a lot of them, it's a daunting task to say, look, I'm a new reader. What should I read?
Here's 40 years worth of continuity.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, where should I start with Batman? It's like, well, you can start in one of these 5 locations.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I usually tell people is I point them to, a creator-owned book because, most of the time they have a beginning, middle, end.
Yep. And it's usually just one series. So you're like, well, buy issue 1 and you'll be at the start, or grab the first trade paperback or what may have you, And so you look at something like, and I think you see that also in the sales when you do have a series that gets turned into media or whatever, like, so a new Spider-Man movie comes out, and Spider-Man comics don't necessarily, the monthly comics don't see a huge spike in readership.
Yeah.
Because I think there's so many different Spider-Man books they could get. But you look at something like The Walking Dead, well, people go out and they buy those books in droves because it's one series and it's one book that they can easily sort of point at,
Oh, totally. That makes, yeah. I mean, it's actually that. I actually want to ask a kind of a weird opinion question. Then we've asked a few different people who've been on the show, but if you would introduce someone who didn't read comics, like, what would you point them to? It's a tough one, right? Like,
the common answer tends to be like, I point them towards something that I love, and that's a great answer. But what I usually do is I kind of turn the question back on them. I say, what kind of movies do you like? What kind of media do you already consume? And then let me focus you towards that, rather than it being about, here's what I like.
Yeah.
If you love Quentin Tarantino movies, like, then start reading Preacher or, like stuff like that, rather than me just saying, here's what I like, you should like it too. Obviously I want people to love what I love, but it's a lot easier to sort of focus them on the types of things that they're already reading or they're already, into.
Yeah. And
my dad, wouldn't read the kinds of comics that I like, but he grew up listening to the old radio serials of like The Lone Ranger and The Shadow. So I got him those comics and he quite enjoys them.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So you're like, oh, okay, that's a natural fit. I'm not necessarily buying every issue of The Shadow, but my dad would, he could get into that. And that's the kind of thing that I can sort of look at and go, okay, it's not about my taste. It's about, sort of teaching you, without trying to sound too, school marm or whatever, teaching you that the comics medium has something for you, not just, okay, now you have to read the X-Men, because I read the X-Men. Yeah. So I point people towards, commonly I'll point them towards things like Bone, or I point them towards Raina Tellemeyer's stuff, like Smile and Sisters, depending on who they are. I point them towards graphic novels, obviously stuff like Saga or Walking Dead or Atomic Robo, stuff that is easy to get into and doesn't have a dearth of continuity and tends to be really clear in terms of the storytelling.
Yeah.
And then, over time you can sort of shift them into more complex, more stuff, not that those books aren't great, they're phenomenal, but you can sort of then say, okay, now let's look at superheroes.
Yeah.
The weird vortex of storytelling that's required to get you in the door on that, potentially, you know what I mean?
Yeah, really at the end of the day, if you really want a superhero, you just have to bite the bullet and just pick something and start somewhere and, go on Wikipedia, read what's happened.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because I remember when I was a kid, I started reading Amazing Spider-Man, and I started right in the middle of whatever. It was in the early 200s of Amazing Spider-Man, and tons of stuff had happened.
Yeah.
But it didn't feel like I couldn't get on board. Like, it was all still, okay, Spider-Man, the baseline is relatively straightforward,
Yeah.
And there's some great superhero books right now that do a really good job at bringing in new readers without making you feel like an idiot. I think Mark Waid's Daredevil series is phenomenal.
Yes.
And it's always really good at letting you know there's a sense of history and stuff has happened to the character, but you don't feel like you had to read every single one in order to be on board.
Yeah.
Ms. Marvel is phenomenal, and it feels like sort of the modern era Spider-Man, where you've got this youthful character trying to figure themselves out.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, just stuff like that. So even the superhero books, I think there's ones that are kind of easy access in that way.
Yeah.
If you're careful about it.
Yeah. Superhero books. If you were to choose one or two superhero books that you would like to write, which would they be?
I always say, Spider-Man was like my guy growing up, and I really meant a lot to me. So that's obviously like the holy grail. The only thing that's a little weird about that is Dan Slott's doing such a phenomenal job on the book.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, yeah, that's just not going to happen. A, and B, I don't want Dan to stop writing the book. So
Yeah.
it's like, on the one hand, I would love to write Spider-Man. On the other hand, keep doing what you're doing, current team, because you're amazing. So it's sort of weird. I love Doctor Strange. I'm really glad that they're doing a new Doctor Strange series.
Yeah.
And I could sit there and be like, oh, I wish it was me. But on the other hand, it's really cool seeing the character coming into prominence again, and the idea that there's going to be a movie out there and people are going to be that much into the character. For me, I was a huge Sword and Sorcery fan growing up, and Doctor Strange was like the perfect balance point. Oh, he's like a wizard and he's a superhero?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That guy's like my fantasy fix and my superhero fix.
Yeah.
Perfect.
It's hitting all the cylinders just right.
Oh, yeah. So I love Doctor Strange. I loved Thor for that same kind of reason.
Yeah.
Dude running around with a giant warhammer kicking ass. Yeah, those are characters that immediately jump to mind as characters that I would love to write. On the DC front, I like... and again, it's this weird thing where the media around them is now swirling, but I've always liked the Suicide Squad because it's almost got that skull kickery kind of mercenary. Okay, we're gonna, do our mission even if it kills us because we're ridiculous.
Yeah.
I like Harley Quinn a lot. I had fun writing a short story with her for Legends of the Dark Knight for Batman. I quite like Zatanna. Again, the magic thing is really big. I would love to write Zatanna. I think that would be a ton of fun, and you can make a really cool and ridiculous kind of supernatural series with that. Other characters in that kind of vein, just sort of, I like characters that are proactive and big action. I love writing action. I love writing big set piece kind of crazy stuff happening.
Yeah.
So any kind of character that pushes that stuff forward, I'm in.
That's awesome. All right, let's talk a little bit about Skull Kickers. So Skull Kickers ended this week. Congrats again on that. Such an amazing run, an amazing series. I love the random numbering that you added to the final issue.
Thanks. So to let your listeners know, so the last issue of the series technically would be issue 34.
Yeah.
But, this Skull Kickers is a very sarcastic series and very tongue-in-cheek, and we tend to mock the comic industry a little bit.
Yeah.
And they've had this tendency to renumber their books until there's an anniversary, at which point they throw the numbers back to, or they calculate in very weird ways.
Yes.
Ways to sort of say, okay, no, it's an anniversary issue because they know those sell more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, it's the last issue of our series and it's issue 34, but I want a big number, so we'll just call it 100.
Yep.
So we just put 100 on the cover. And we came up with an in-story justification for it as well in a kooky way. But at the end of the day, it was mostly because I thought it would be funny.
Yeah. So, what did the series overall mean to you? I know that, you put a lot of time and effort into it. It's really the book that, where I started reading a lot of your work and, you came up on my radar. So now that it's over, like, what does it mean to you and, how does it feel?
It's one of the, I don't want to sound too dramatic. Like, I don't want to, like nail my wrist to my forehead, but like Skull Kickers has changed my life. So what happened was I had done a few stories and I had written some stuff. I did a webcomic from 2001 to 2003. That was a story I put together called The Makeshift Miracle and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, I got into this business with entertainment as a whole to be a storyteller. And I had sort of been caught into this vortex of project management and kind of managing other people's stuff instead of creating my own. Mm-hmm. And so Skull Kickers really represents to me this idea that I can make something and I can finish it. I can take it through to the finish line. And so it really kind of gave me my confidence back, and it proved to me that I could create something that was professional quality, and it put me on the map for a lot of companies that would eventually end up hiring me to write for them. And so none of that stuff would have happened, creatively speaking, without Skull Kickers. So in that way, when I say it changed my life, it really did. It sort of gave me a new career as a comic writer. And so it's always going to be very, very near and dear to me. And everything else that I've done since then owes itself to what I did on Skull Kickers, even when it's totally different styles of projects or totally different styles of writing. None of it would have happened if I wouldn't have, pushed that ball down the hill kind of thing. And so, it feels really strange to be done it now, but I'm also really proud of the fact that we were able to finish it and that I've got that body of work now, done and in the can and able to look at it as a whole and say, we did that, you know? And so for whatever, I'm sure I could find flaws in it and I'm sure I could nitpick 100 little things, but really to me, I just got this incredible warm sense of this amazing thing that we were able to put together and how important it's become, to sort of my creative journey.
Awesome. So that's Skull Kickers. Let's talk a little Wayward.
Sure.
That series, honestly, it's one of my favorite series. It's my go-to every week or every month that it comes out. That's the first book that I read. I love the anime feeling. As I've said many times, you and Steve, I can tell you guys have done so much research because it just feels authentic. It doesn't feel like you guys are just trying to replicate Japanese culture and whatnot. Wayward's done its second arc. You should tell listeners a little bit about sort of, Wayward and where you plan on going with it.
Well, Wayward is a really big story and a very different kind of story. So I wanted, Skull Kickers is this sword and sorcery comedy, and people expect from me kind of action silliness and that's cool because that's the stuff that I love. But Wayward was a real, kind of focused attempt to sort of show, okay, look, I've got all sorts of different kinds of stories to tell. Steve and I have been talking about working together for years, and the timing finally worked, and we were able to put this thing into play. So Wayward's a bit like Buffy in Japan in the sense that you've got teenagers fighting monsters. In this case, though, it's teenagers in Tokyo fighting Japanese mythological monsters called yokai, which are like the spirits and the mythological monsters. So the same kind of thing you'd have in Europe where you've got unicorns and you've got the manticore or stuff like that. This is those types of legends, but in Japan. So we're taking a lot of those traditional kind of myths and we're updating them for the modern world and sort of showing them and contrasting them with modern Japan. And so Steve, who lives in Yokohama, which is just outside of Tokyo, and he's raising a family there, and myself, we both love this stuff. We're both really into it. So we've done a slew of research to try and make it as, authentic as possible and just deliver on the potential of these really, really cool, and to a North American audience at least, exotic, kind of stories and monsters. And it's just been a real great challenge. Like, it's really pushed me as a writer to think deeper and to create something really complex and to see about, sort of taking my storytelling skills hopefully to the next level. And the response has been great. People are really into it. They're really enjoying it. We try and bring something really exciting and unexpected from month to month. And so far we seem to be doing it.
Yeah. Like the number of characters you have in that book, I can't even imagine how you can write so many characters into, one single issue. And I know that
the week pages a month. It's we're not Game of Thronesing it, but it's getting pretty dense at this point.
Yeah, like
I've got a chart in my office that's sort of a listing of everyone and where they're currently at, where I'm scripting.
Yeah.
And just trying to make sure everyone's sort of checked off. Okay, what's happening? What are they doing? What's the forward momentum and where are we going with their character stuff? And even when I sit down, like Steve and I, he's obviously on the other side of the world, but we usually meet up on Google Hangout once or twice a week to sort of talk about how things are going. And sometimes I'm walking him through all of it and he's just like, okay, so what's happening? Like, where put that again? I'm like, no, don't worry. This is going, oh, right. We're just sort of like stepping through this thing and reminding each other of all the different little bits we've got to take care of from, issue to issue. it's like I said, it's a real challenge, and I love that about it. I love the fact that it's pushing me every single month to try and make all the pieces work and make it all, feel like it's got to read really well and smooth, but under the hood you're just frantically working your ass off.
Oh, and that shows. Like, at no point was I like, what just happened, or who's this, or where's this person. It's always been an easy read, and
Cool.
just expecting that character to come back or to do their next move or whatever. It's been a really fun ride these past two arcs.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, the response from people, I keep expecting sort of the other shoe to drop and people to be like, oh, it's not working. Or they're like, oh, you're changing too much, because we're doing some really big dramatic things in the story.
Mm-hmm.
So far, the readership seems really, they trust us and they're on board, and they want to see what comes
like I say, and I have put this in almost every review, is, Jim Zub and Steve Cummings are creating their way world. Like, it's huge, and it just somehow it's all made sense, and it's been awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's it is one of those things too where I think with each sort of chapter, obviously in any kind of collaboration, you get more comfortable and you realize what your strengths are and what the other people you're working with, what their strengths are, and so you feed off of each other's energy. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of that here too, where some of the initial ideas I had about where the series could go that I was a little bit timid about in the first few issues, I feel like by the second arc we got our footing, and I was like, okay, no, we're going to go for it. Like, we're going to take some bigger risks, because I'd rather do that, especially on a creator-owned series, than look back and be like, oh, we could have taken it further. We could have gone bigger. You know what I mean? We could have made a bigger splash or surprised people more. And so this is the place to do it. Take those risks and see where they lead.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So you had mentioned earlier that you wanted to write stories. You wanted to be a creator of sorts in the entertainment business. Currently, you're working on comic books. Are you working on anything else? Like, would you ever see yourself writing a novel, TV, movies?
I have done a little bit of animation writing, and that's something that I'd be interested in doing, more of, depending on the scheduling stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm currently in the running to be possibly writing a video game.
Oh, awesome.
Nice.
With a pretty big company, so they contacted me and asked about my interest, and we're sort of talking back and forth, so it'll depend on what their needs end up being and schedule and if it all fits. But that could be a really cool challenge, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's not something where, like, I don't begrudge anyone wanting to do different stuff, like, but I'm not in comics because I really want to do movies. You know what I mean? Like, I'm in comics because I really want to do comics, and that's my first goal. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to keep making stories, and I love my ability to do that in a relatively controlled and focused way. Like, I'm not against doing movie stuff, and I'm sure at some point, if the opportunity came up, I would definitely be interested in trying that out. But that's not really my focal point right now.
Yeah.
Even the little bit that I've done in terms of animation, and I can see there's a lot more limitations in terms of, the bigger the money that's involved and the more, people that need to approve that stuff, the more difficult it is to put your kind of personal notes into it. And that's totally cool. That makes sense. When people are paying money, they deserve to have their voice. They deserve to, throw in. But with a movie production or even TV, there's so many people and there's so many voices and there's so much money involved that you can lose some of that individuality.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
It's not as much of a priority to me. I thoroughly enjoy the focus that I've been able to get doing comics. And, that's sort of where my head's at for the time being.
Yeah. No, that does make sense. Yeah. Makes sense to me. For our listeners who don't already know, the reason why I've always respected Jim Zub is because on Twitter, I like to say he keeps it real. I know a lot of people always ask you tons of questions about getting in the business, what the business is actually like. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about that part of the industry. And I know that this always comes up. So I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice for any aspiring writers for them to sort of get their foot in?
I mean, it's always a weird kind of question too, because I feel like as much as I've made a lot of progress, I'm still learning a lot. And so whenever I try and give people advice or I try and give them feedback and stuff, I try and temper it with this idea of, look, I don't have all the answers, and I certainly don't know every single, pitfall that you can, find in this business. So please don't, assume that this is a singular and only answer, or that I have some monolithic sort of control of how these things are going to work. But on the other hand, I've been doing this for a little while and I've had some experiences, and if I can advise people or give them a little bit of feedback that hopefully will help them to avoid a pitfall or look at something with a little bit of clarity, then I feel like that's really important. And so I try to do so as much as I can. And that's quite a preamble. Anyways, the point, it's like I'm warning, Jim doesn't know everything.
Yeah, warning,
That's
Jim
the
doesn't
short
secretly
version of
run
what
the
I
comic
just said.
industry.
So, more than anything else, I think people get paralyzed by their thoughts about what could be instead of just hunkering down and making things. So they're so busy worried about, well, what's step 12? How am I going to, impress this publisher, or what do I do in order to, get on the project that I love, rather than looking and saying, do I have the skills, or am I showing the skills that they need to see, that a company needs to see in order to hire me? And the only way to do that is to make stuff, is to make stories. And that means you'll screw up and you'll do crappy ones. But I don't know what it is. In a creative business, I think people have very weird expectations about their own skill level and what it takes to get better at it. Like, for some reason, people think, I don't know if it's just American Idol kind of model of you see these people step up and all of a sudden they become a star because they sang a song really well for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But you don't see the fact that they practiced and they worked and this has been their passion for years, you know. People get this idea in their head that the destiny or something is all that matters, instead of, hard work and practice. I never would have, no one, I'm trying to think even how to say this. Like Samurai Jack was not a project that I sought out and thought, oh my God, I hope when I grow up I get a chance to write Samurai Jack. That was an opportunity that came up because of Skull Kickers and because of other work that I had done. And it's a great project and it's a great fit for my skills. And it feels like a really good, solid, fit for the type of work that I do. But the reason why I got it is because I made those other things. Yeah. And so rather than worrying about, oh man, I wish I could write Wolverine or whatever, focus on like making stories, telling stories, making them as high quality as you can, and then learning from them, and then moving on to the next project. Like if you wanted to be a baseball pitcher, you wouldn't just walk out onto the baseball field and beg the team to let you play. You would join, a small baseball team, or you would go through all the different levels of training, and then, your AAA and your AA and your all those different things that you need before you maybe get called up to the majors. Yep. And it's really the same in any other sort of field. If I wanted to be a chef, I don't just walk into a restaurant and be like, hey, can I be in charge? They're like, well, have you ever made food before? Yeah. And they're like, well, I watch the Food Network. And you're like, yeah, that's great. I love food. It's my dream. It's what I've always wanted to do. You're like, well, but do you cook? No, but man, I can't stop reading about food.
Yeah.
And when it comes to comics, I find a lot of people have a very similar mentality.
They do, yeah.
They go, man, I really want to write blah character.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, have you ever written a story before? You're like, no, but I read comics all the time and I read all the websites and I'm really into it. You're like, great, that means you're a fan. No, but I want to be a writer. Then you should write things. You should write stories and you should get better at them. And the only way to get better at them is to do them, Yeah. And so it sounds like a really blindingly obvious piece of advice. But don't worry about step 30. Like, step 1 is make stories, get better at them, improve your skills, focus on that as much as you can. And then, be a part of that community, be a part of that creative community. And that doesn't mean like tweeting at Brian Michael Bendis and expecting that he's going to respond. It's more like, finding another group of people kind of in your own weight class who are making and being creative. And then as your skills grow, their skills grow, and you're a little community and you look out for each other. And that's really what happened with us. Like the Udon guys kind of looked out for each other and built up their skills and did things together. And we've all kind of grown in terms of our opportunities and the things that have happened to us. And the same holds true with the people who were on the web around the same time that I was putting my original webcomic online. Like I became friends with like the Penny Arcade guys or Scott Kurtz from PvP. And we were all just kind of doing stuff without a sense of, oh man, 10 years from now, we're all going to be a big deal. You know, it was just, we're making things. And so rather than being focused on the end goal, we were focused on the immediate, which was making stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. Like, you have to pay your dues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think people think pay your dues is something like, oh, well, you've got to suck up to people, or you've got to be, you can't get in unless you kiss ass or something like that. It's like, no, that's not actually it. What they mean by that is you have to make stuff and you have to prove that your work is of professional caliber.
Yeah, gotta hone your skills.
Don't expect necessarily you're going to get the opportunity you imagine, because other things are going to come up, and then if you make good use of them, hopefully they turn into other great opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was really funny you compared it to American Idol, because I always thought it was the 80s montage screwed people up, because it's like, no, it's just an afternoon is all you need to be the best.
Right.
Yeah.
Just one really good song number.
Yeah, and then you've got it.
And it's all coming together.
Yeah. So another one of the, jumping back to another one of Kyle's questions, he was wondering what's influencing you now, like especially you were saying you're doing a bunch of research for Wayward, jumping back to that for a bit, and like where are the influences coming from, because part of being a writer is you got to read and you got to take stuff in. So it's wondering what's
totally.
inspiring and influencing you
it can
now?
be a little bit difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it can be a little bit difficult to even trying to keep up on comics while you're making comics.
Yeah,
like,
I can
it's
imagine.
one of those weird things too. I know guys that are working in video games, and the last thing they do when they go home is play video games because they're exhausted by the whole thing.
Yeah.
But it's true though. Like I try and keep up on books. I used to try and make sure that I would read every book that was being made by friends of mine. But as I've been doing more and more stuff and meeting more people, that's impossible now.
Yeah. Do you have like a pile waiting for you?
I can't even keep up on Charles Soule's books, and he's a dear friend of mine. The other guy's writing too much stuff. But it's like, so you try and keep up on books you hear are good. I try not to hate read. I try not to read books that suck for the sake of sucking. Like, it's easy to sit there and read books that are not what you would want them to be and be like, I could do better than that. You're like, whatever. It's not going to get you anywhere. That's not going to help.
Yeah.
So I try and read stuff that inspires or things that I think are really, really phenomenal, and then kick myself and want more out of my own work.
But it makes you do better, not be like, I'm better than this guy. Fine.
Well, that's great.
You want it to always be challenging, to always be the...
Point at all sorts of garbage and say, look, I'm better than garbage.
Yeah.
Well done.
Just like, congratulations.
It's quite a bar you've set for yourself. So it's like, trying to stay, sort of focused on what I can look at and improve upon. Or, it can be weird once you have a little bit of a body of work. I don't tend to like reread my own stuff too much, but from time to time I read my stuff and I sort of try and look at it with a little bit of detachment. Like, okay, it's been a couple years since I wrote this story. Does it hold up? What do I like about it? What do I think Jim Zub's doing well? You know what I mean? And try and remember that and reconnect with it so that I don't sort of lose track of that moving forward.
Okay.
I also just take in a lot more experiences. So when I'm traveling, whether it's convention travel or travel for fun, I try and listen more. I want to hear how people speak, so it helps me to write dialogue. I try and, if someone else is telling a story, I want to sort of look at it and think about, okay, what is the emotional core of this, or why is this affecting me, or what? You almost become like a little Terminator. It's like you're analyzing everything around you. I watch a movie or a TV show, and if it's really good, I sort of go, okay, that was amazing. Why did this emotionally affect me, or what made it good? And if it sucks, I can learn from it too. I'm like, why did this lose my attention? Why am I no longer committed to this? And how can I make sure I don't do that in my own stories?
Yeah, because everything gets broken down into constituent parts, and you're like, here's the good, here's the bad, and how can I internalize? I guess it's like a mechanic. If they heard, they get in your car, they're like, I hear something weird with the engine, they can't help it. Yeah.
I'm sort of like that when I'm looking at stories now. Like I want to know how they tick. I want to get under the hood and really understand them as much as I can. I think it can be a little annoying sometimes for other people.
Yeah.
It's like I'll be with my family and they'll be telling me an anecdote or something, and they're just really poor at dramatically pacing it. And they don't answer questions about what I need to know in order to give a damn. And so I'm getting confused by the story, and I'm like asking for clarification, and they're just like, why are you worried about this? I'm like, you're not doing this right. For God's sake, we set the scene, like.
Come on, draw me in.
It's a little weird sometimes.
Yeah, you're
But I'm sure it's like anyone in any business. I'm sure if you tried to cook for a chef, they would be like, stop doing that.
Yeah. Just everything's like, no, the garlic needs to be later.
Oh my God, you're killing it.
Exactly. The other thing that you always talk about also is the financial point of view. So we already talked about sort of, an inspiring writer needs to write, but they also need to have that realistic expectation as to how much money they're going to be getting once they actually get their work out there.
Where's the food coming from?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think people are shocked when I've had, it's always weird to talk about this in a detached sense. To say, okay, I've had a certain degree of success, but comics are still not my only job, and I'm still teaching and I'm still doing that work because the reality is that comics can really come and go in terms of financial stability.
Yeah.
And so I looked at it and I said, okay, I could live a very, very frugal life, and we can move outside of the big city, and that would be that, or I can try and balance both, and teaching acts as sort of my financial stability and something I also really love while I'm doing these writing projects. And that's, what works best for us now in our family. And so, but that's been a tough decision because I know a lot of people, they'll talk to me and they can't believe that I'm doing this and I'm teaching, or that I'm not just focused on my writing. Or they're like, well, you're writing a lot of stuff. It's like, yeah, but that comes and goes in terms of the amount of work that's involved. On my peak last year, I was writing 6 books in a month, and that was unhealthy in a lot of ways because it was so much work. But then once those projects wrap up, it's you're no longer on the steak train. You're it's a much different financial situation. And creator-owned books can really come and go. Like I've never shied away from the fact that Skull Kickers has not always been the most financially successful series. But that wasn't what it was about. It was about making something and showing people that I could create something of professional quality. It wasn't about, okay, we're making big bucks. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would be happy to make big bucks. But it was really, I have a story to tell, and we're doing this thing, and making sure that the art team gets paid because they have to focus almost completely on Skull Kickers, whereas I can write a lot more than just one book. So
yep, that's exactly it. Like there's a lot of sacrifices, a lot of thinking, a lot of discussions that you have to have with your family and things like that I think a lot of people kind of don't realize when they say I want to be a comic book writer.
Well, and without trying to sound really crass, and I'm not begrudging anyone, in many ways I could look at a lot of different occupations and I could make assumptions about what that occupation entails. But I think a lot of people, when they say they want to be a writer, what they really mean is they want to have written. So they want to have a successful book that they're sitting around autographing and people are telling them they're smart and great.
Yeah, they want to be David Duchovny in Californication.
Yeah, they want to have success. And it's like, well, without trying to be too crass, who doesn't? Like, we all want to have success, right? But the steps involved and the sacrifices involved in doing that, when my parents haven't seen me for months on end because I've got crazy cascading deadlines, or when I'm on the road traveling doing promotion, trying to make every convention a winner so that we can build up the war chest and make more stories.
Exactly.
People just look at it and they go, oh, you're traveling, that's so exciting. And it's like, it is good, and I love traveling, and I'm totally into it. But there's times when it's a grind, and there's times when writing is a grind, and there's times when it's difficult. But you still have to do it. It's not just about doing it when it's fun. It's not just about doing it when it's exciting, and so those are the aspects I think that people don't realize. I was at New York Comic Con last year, and someone came up to me and they said, I'm going to be where you are next year. And I said, well, I hope not, because I'm at this table. But not only that, but I think they had this idea of like, well, if I say it and then it'll happen. You're like, yeah, desire is a big part of doing, but beyond saying it, there's doing it. There's the will to carry it out and to prioritize it over other things. And there's no right or wrong answer. Sometimes people say to me, oh, I want to write stories. And I go, you can. And they sort of give me this weird, like, half smile, like, no, like, really? Yeah. Like, no, like, really?
Yeah.
But you have to start doing it, and then you have to realize, oh, those other things that people asked you to do this weekend, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Not if you're working on this thing, you know what I mean? Or you don't have, if you have a kid or if you have other things that are getting in your way, you have to decide. Not that I'm saying, like, don't raise children, but just every time you've got things going on, you're going to have to prioritize.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's, in a creative lifestyle where it's not a 9-to-5 job, it's that much more difficult.
Yeah. It's really it's very similar to any job, really. But I think really what I've noticed with the comic industry is that people just have these weird ideas and dreams. And again, it's not to say don't dream big, but you have to work to get there. And, these...
Yeah.
It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, but I think there's this weird sense of, and it's not entitlement. It's not quite the right word I want to use, but, so someone says, oh, I want to write whatever, Spider-Man, because I now know the business and I know more about it. The first thing I think about is, oh, Dan Slott writes Spider-Man. Do I want Dan Slott fired? Like, is that my goal?
Yeah.
No, I want to write that book. Like, okay, I think I could do a good job at it, but now I know these people and I know what they're doing and I know who they are and I know the type of passion they have.
Yeah.
And so that empathy of sort of looking and saying, oh, it's not all about me. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just my dreams. Like, everyone who's wanted to work in this business has those kinds of dreams, has those kinds of desires. And I hope that I get a chance to partake in some of them, but hopefully I'm not selfish enough to just only think of myself as well,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Something I was meaning to ask the entire interview is, so, there's been a lot more focus on creator-owned books, with tons of the all different Marvel books. You're seeing some pretty big names missing from their lineup. I know not every book's been announced, but Rick Remender's already said that he wants to step back, focus on family, create her own projects. Kelly C. DeConnick sounds like she's going to be working more on a lot of her creator-owned books. Do you see this shift on, some of the quote-unquote more established writers moving towards creator-owned for whether it be financial gains, whether it be control, whether it be just, having time again?
I think it's a mixture of those things. The corporate projects are a lot of work, not that creator-owned's not, God knows, but
Yeah.
they're very different types of expectations, and so what seemed to happen before was that people would do creator-owned books, or even 4 or 5 years ago, people would do creator-owned books to prove themselves, to get a Marvel gig or to get a DC gig. And it's almost like the polarity is reversing, where people are realizing, actually, if I build myself as and I hate to use the term, but I don't know how else to put it, as a brand, that people aren't just reading. I mean, obviously there are a chunk of people that read Samurai Jack because they loved the show and they wanted to read New Adventures of Jack. But there was a percentage of people that were reading it because they liked Skull Kickers or because they liked the other work that I've done, and vice versa, that hopefully after Jack was over, some of those people come with me and check out Skull Kickers, or they check out Wayward, or they check out Dungeons and Dragons and other stuff I'm doing. And so as much as it is, the book that it is, it's also a Jim Zub book, and that will eventually carry weight on its own sort of merits. And I think you see that with someone like Kelly Sue, or you see that with Matt Fraction, or Kieran Gillen, or any of those guys, where they are building their own kind of audience that is into the stuff they're into.
Yeah.
They realize that has a real strength in the market, and that loyalty, they can work with and create something very unique if they're at a certain point in their success. And so you're seeing more and more of that, where people, the type of pioneering that the image creators did in the early 90s, when they said, we're at the peak of our career and now we're going to step away from the books we're known for and make our own things. It is kind of the same sort of pioneering mindset, where these guys are like, look, I've got a lot of pull right now. I've got the ability to sort of bring an audience to a story, and I don't want to let that slip through my fingers. So, rather than trying to prioritize and keep all the plates spinning, I'm going to step away from my corporate gigs for a bit and do this thing.
Yeah.
And really maximize the potential, hopefully. Mm-hmm. And if it works, the financial potential is huge because the market is, that much more engaged with it. And the international market, so like foreign reprinting or whether it's movie or television adaptation and all that stuff, if it happens, you've got sort of the gold ring there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it feels like it's not as big a risk to at least try and do something in that space.
Yep, exactly. All right, we've talked a lot about the business, about certain particular projects of yours. Let's talk in general. What's coming up for Jim Zub in the next few months?
I'm at a weird sort of space right now where we just wrapped up, the last arc of Skull Kickers. Wayward Arc 2 is done, so we're in development on the third arc. We're working away on that. I was scripting on that this morning, plugging away on the new issues. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to be taking a lot of my focus right now. I've got a second Disney miniseries that I'm doing based on Epcot, which is, Figment and Dreamfinder, which is coming out in September. And cool. Disney, it seems weird because I'm talking all about creator owned, and then I'm like, hey, I'm doing this Disney project. Yeah. The biggest entertainment company on earth. But it's been great. They've actually been really wonderful to work with. And the Imagineering team is very supportive, and they're very cool about sort of I came to the table with this story and they wanted me to do it. And so they haven't been like, they're not choking the life out of it. It's very much about let's collaborate and make something really special. And so it's nice to have that happening. But I'm almost done. That's the weirdest part. By the time the first issue comes out, I will be finishing the final issue.
Yeah, it's is it just a 5-issue again?
Yeah, it's another 5-issue miniseries like we did with the first one. And if it does well, I'm sure there will be, discussion of do we go with another one or what comes next. But it's nice because the weird thing is in some ways the pressure is off. By the time the book's coming out, I'm pretty much done. So hopefully people like it, but I can't change it even if they didn't. Yeah. It is what it is at that point. You just sort of ride it out. And we were very fortunate that the first series was so well received and the Disney fandom really, really loved it. And I'm actually heading to the D23 Expo, which is the Disney convention.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Next weekend. And so I'm going to be promoting Figment there and doing a signing with the Imagineering team, which is kind of surreal and wonderful.
Very cool.
And so I've got those two projects that are immediate. I've got a couple pitches that are in for some corporate stuff that one of them is what we lovingly call a bake-off. So that's like there's multiple writers who have pitched on a particular property.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to see who gets it. That's what happened with Samurai Jack. There were seven writers that pitched for Jack.
Oh, wow.
Is the one they decided to go with, which is nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
But nerve-wracking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so... looking, hoping that all goes through well, and I've got more of those kinds of projects coming down the pipe, but we'll see. Anything's possible.
Yeah.
And then I've also got some creator-owned stuff that I'm slowly developing. So, when we did the last arc of Skull Kickers, and when Wayward launched, Skull Kickers was on hiatus. And so it still felt kind of like I just had one creator-owned book because there was only one running at any one time. But doing the last arc of Skull Kickers and the second arc of Wayward was really, really intense in terms of the workload. And so my original plan was I was going to have new creator-owned pitches ready to deliver to publishers at San Diego. And then I realized, oh God, that's not happening. I'm exhausted. So now I'm sort of looking at New York Comic Con and saying, okay, that's when I'm going to be kind of putting out the feelers for my next creator-owned project and slowly see, what comes next. But I don't want to even put a timeline on when we would launch it or what it's going to be. Because even with Wayward, there was a few projects in between Skull Kickers and Wayward that were in development and that I thought were happening. And then they scuttled out for various reasons. Either publishers didn't go for them or the artist wasn't available anymore or, just plans change. And so I got stuff in the hopper, but I'm not too stressed about it, something will come about, and just keep plugging away.
Cool.
Yeah.
In terms of conventions, where can we find you?
Well, I'm going to be at the D23 Expo.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a table or anything. It's not that kind of convention. I'm going to be doing presentations on Sunday, mostly, including a signing at the show. I'm also going to be at Fan Expo Canada, which is here in Toronto. And that's like the biggest, kind of pop culture comic show in Canada.
Yeah.
And I'll have a table set up there. I'll be there every day of the show. We're going to have the second Wayward trade launching there, which is great because a year ago when we launched the series, that was our first issue.
Yep.
And now 1 year later, we've got 2 trade paperbacks, which I feel really proud of.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Able to keep the momentum
because
strong.
There's some creator-owned books that just the hiatus, like, again, things happen, but it kind of really loses its momentum.
Oh, yeah, it hurts the momentum big time. Like, I don't know if we can keep... I don't know if next year I'll have 4 trades. That would be pretty freaking amazing, but I don't know if that's possible.
Hefty, yeah.
But I do know we will definitely, have the third arc done and continue to crank away on it.
It just amazes me, like, the saga, how Fiona Staples and Brian K. Vaughan can keep their momentum and their schedule the way that they have it.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing is that for both of them, that can be their absolute full-time job.
Exactly. That's, they have that advantage.
Killing in terms of the sales.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes it that much easier when you don't feel the pressure of, I have to take on all these 100 other things. I mean, obviously it helps that the book's phenomenal. It's not like quality is the biggest, sort of factor there, of course. But what else? So Fan Expo Canada is going to be great. And then it looks like I'm going to be doing a Tipaticon, which is like this little webcomic show that's going to be happening in Maryland. That's run by friends of mine who run Tipatico, the guys that do questionable content and all sorts of other cool webcomics. It's mostly like an excuse just to hang out with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to be there, and it's going to be a ton of fun. I'm also going to be doing New York Comic Con. And that's where we're going to kind of have our big kind of blowout for Skull Kickers, because we're going to have the last collections there for sale. And Edwin and I are going to be set up together and sort of doing the big send-off for the series. So the last issue is out. But the last trade paperback and the last sort of deluxe hardcover will be available at New York.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then also you can find the Conan Red Sonja hardcover out in stores right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just came out.
Those books were...
really proud of that.
Yeah, those books are...
told me when I was like 12 years old that I had my name on a Conan book.
Yeah.
And just ridiculous.
Actually, before we go, I did have one question, and I've been meaning to ask you this via email for so long, is how did you and Gail Simone sort of, split the writing duties? Because what I've always said, it's absolutely seamless. Like you can't even tell who wrote what, and that made that even cooler for me.
Oh, cool. Thank you. It was a ton of fun. So Gail brought me on board that project, and she's been a dear friend and a supporter for quite some time. And so I was really, honored to even be invited into it. And so first things first, we sort of sat down and said, okay, let's do like a laundry list of the kinds of things we want to do on this series. So we, it was like a wish list. What makes Conan and Red Sonja so awesome, and what can we do to exemplify it? If this is our only chance to ever write these two titans sort of together, let's just blow it out and go for broke. Mm-hmm. And so, we were just back and forth. We need this kind of a thing. There's got to be some sort of a theft and a caper, or there's got to be a gladiatorial combat scene, and this sort of stuff. So it's almost like we were building this wish list of best of Conan, Red Sonja kind of moments, and then working our way backwards through them and figuring out a plot that would fit them all in. One of the things early on that we were really a little stressed about was, well, what era of Conan and Red Sonja do you want to deal with? Do you want to have them when they're young and impetuous, or do you want to have them when they're older and more experienced?
Yeah.
And Gail quite brilliantly came up with the conceit that they would do something in their youth that would pay dividends when they were older. So we didn't have to pick. We could use every generation of them. And that became the framework for everything else.
Yeah.
And so once we had this broad idea of these are the types of set pieces and this is the kind of stuff we're going to do, then Gail had the idea about the stuff called Bloodroot, which was this plant that, with this cursed plant that would kill millions if it left unchecked. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of built that into a framework that made the overarching sort of plot. This is what's going to happen. These things happen at these times. And so we got that approved by the rights holders for both Conan and Red Sonja. And then we had it plotted out, and then we did what was essentially what's called sort of like ping ponging the script. So Gail would write 5 or 6 pages, and then I would write 5 or 6 pages, building on what she'd written, and back and forth and back and forth. And then once the entire issue script was written that way, we would both do kind of an edit pass and make sure that the dialogue worked and it sounded seamless, or that the scene to scene transitions were correct, and that it didn't feel like two people tug of war, but that it felt like one consistent story. And it's funny because the early drafts of the scripts, there are some weird ways that I do things that are different than Gail, that if you'd have seen it, you'd be like, well, it's friggin' obvious who wrote which stuff. Like one of the things, I tend to use a lot more sound effects. So we would have fight scenes, and my fight scenes would just be littered with sound effects, and hers would be mostly silent. And you'd be like, oh, well, crap. It's so obvious which one's which, right? So we would go back in and adjust those so it wasn't quite so painful, which one was which, and kind of come up with a standard that would fit the story as a whole. But that was the whole, on the first issue, that's where we sort of figured that all out, where we kind of, oh, this is how we work together, or this is what works best for the two of us. And then our editor, of course, Dave was amazing. He was great at exemplifying what was needed in the script, or what elements we were putting into it that would have the most impact. And so having his guiding hand, being able to step away as a third party and sort of say, okay, here's what I like, and here's what I think you're doing really well, was super valuable. So that the two of us weren't too, that we weren't overly precious about particular elements, or, that our egos were properly in check as we were going through this thing. So it wasn't as something as simple as like I'm writing all the Conan and she's writing all the Red Sonja. It was very much back and forth.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why it works, is because we both got to bring some of our strengths to it. And I got to learn a lot about, Gail's really, really strong storytelling instincts and her ability to stage a scene and the way that she thinks about storytelling. So, in my case, I definitely learned a lot just working with her.
Yeah, no, that's it. Like, again, it's not to sound too, it was awesome. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it was a real special project, and I feel like it was a real milestone for me. So, it felt, like I said, really odd. Once we'd wrapped it up, and I kind of looked in the rearview mirror and said, oh man, like that happened. That's really cool, So. Yeah.
So tons of Jim Zub books out. Listeners, be sure to check them out. Hopefully more coming.
Oh, yeah. And the easiest way to find out is to just head to my website. So just jimzub.com. So JIMZUB.com is the easiest place to find me. And there's also a ton of tutorial material, like you were talking about earlier. So if people want to find out about the business, or how I write a script, or how I come up with a story idea, or how a pitch tends to be structured, there's quite a few resources there for people to dig in on.
And it's fantastic. I've been reading through your stuff, and it's just like, oh, this is like, this should be a book that you've written. So,
well, it's it's really nice. Last night I was out at a friend's place, and I got a message from a prose writer who's a friend of mine, and she was saying that she's just getting into pitching for comic book projects now.
Okay.
And she was really nervous about putting her first pitch together, and then she looked at sort of the pitches I had online, and she goes, oh, okay, I can see how this all fits together, and she feels a lot more confident about putting her pitch in. And I thought, man, like if you're able to, if she gets into the industry, and I'm sure she'll do wonderfully, I had even the tiniest part in that, then I feel that much better about what I'm doing, because that's really the point, is I want to be able to help people avoid the pitfalls that I had to figure out the hard way.
Yeah.
So.
It's that strong community that's building that community, it's part of the whole thing.
Absolutely.
And you can find Jim Zub on Twitter. I believe it's at Jim Zub.
It is.
There you go.
Awesome.
So Jim, do you have any final words for our listeners?
I deeply appreciate the support that people have shown for the work I've been doing. So it's something I never want to take for granted. Like, people have a lot of choices when it comes to comics and when it comes to media. So when they pick mine, and when they tell me that the books I'm doing mean a lot to them, it's incredible. It's a really cool feeling, and I just hope that keeps on rolling.
Yep. Well, we hope that we can chat with you again soon.
Cool. Yeah, drop me a line.
Always. So again, we hope to have you again. And Jim Zub, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Trump.
There you have it, listeners. Jim Zub.
And there you have it. As I gotta say, that was a really fun interview back then. It was fun re-listening to it. And again, I pretty much left it uncut. I did remaster it again because of technology and, communication apps weren't as good as they are now and weren't as good quality. So I tried to do what I can, and I hope it came out good enough for all of our listeners. So if you want to send feedback, you can send us feedback. You can find us on the social medias at It's Canon Podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can also email us at show@itscanonpodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Amazon, any podcasting app. Make sure to hit the subscribe. That helps us. Leave a rating, leave a review, and I think we're going to have a contest in the new year with our reviews, but we'll talk about that once we get back to work. So I hope that everyone enjoyed the episode because it was a lot of fun doing it back then, and it was fun to revisit it, especially when you see, where we were back then and where we are now. So again, I want to thank Jim Zub for being such a good person. It's always fun to chat with him, and I hope that we can have him back on the show soon. Having said that, it is time for us to go. On behalf of Tyler and Phil, good night.